Well, it is that week of the year when there are more people on the coast than any other week. Hope you're not struggling too much with the extra traffic and the extra people in your favorite restaurants and coffee shops. I'd like to explore with you today a concept that is I'm hoping that I can come at it from a different angle. And the reason is because I'm going to do a little bit of exploring of where it came from and how it's been practiced in the world. We live in a culture where to be active in the democratic process is to get out and vote. And I'm going to suggest that in the beginning of the process. It's a very small snowflake on the iceberg. In indigenous cultures around the world, and for most of humanity's history, up until the last 6,000 years or so, when a decision gets to be made by the group, everyone in the group sits down. And they've known for some time this decision is going to be made, and they've been contemplating it, and they've been considering it, and they've been taking it into their spiritual world, and they've been loving themselves and loving the possibilities and thinking about their children and their grandchildren for several generations. And then they come together in a circle, and for however long it takes, they listen to every other person in that circle as they share the experience that they have had contemplating and considering and meditating on this decision. It's a little bit different from going down to the polls and putting a check mark in the box. And however long it takes might be a few hours, it might be a few days. And if it is a few days, then the grandmothers wander in and out and make sure everyone is nourished. Because the grandmothers have their own circle as well. It's a bilateral process in most indigenous cultures where the people who are actively involved, men and women, usually men because the women usually hold the space and the men usually act, and it's usually two separate kinds of worlds, but often there are times where women are involved in the action and they participate in the decision. And the older women are holding the space for this process, the grandmothers. They're holding the space for this process, they're holding the well-being of everyone in the process, they're holding the well-being of the group as a whole, they're holding the well-being of generations to come. And when and as the process begins to come to a completion and everyone has been heard and there is this realization of a tendency, of a flow, of a possibility emerging that may not have been in anybody's minds before, but through the dialogue, through the sharing from the heart, through the listening from the heart, something new may be emerging here. And as it begins to become clear, the grandmothers are aware of that, partly because they've been coming in and out, and partly because they've been holding the space. And as they become aware of it, they go into contemplation around what is emerging. And they may have another circle, and they may have another fire, and they may use the energy of the moon and the stars and the trees and the flowing waters to help them feel and know the understanding that is emerging here and the implications and the possibilities thereof. And as they do that, they may bring a voice to that circle, that first circle, where people have been sharing for all these hours and maybe days. And they bring that voice and they say yes, or they say maybe not this way. These are the concerns that come with that way. And so this process continues, and everyone who is likely to be affected is considered in the process and has a voice. That is the basis of the democratic process. And so I'd like to define the democratic process as the gathering together of people to make a decision in a way in which everyone who is going to be affected by that decision is involved in that decision. Okay? We do not live in a democracy. We never have. The U.S. is not a democracy. It is a republic that has attempted to use the democratic process in the development and the governance of the republic. And that's gotten kind of lost, I'd say. So there are a number of organizations and groups and people around the country and around the world who have been exploring this process as they begin to understand the deeper possibilities there. And one of them has been described in a marvelous book. If you're not familiar with it, you might want to be. Spiritual Politics, Corrine McLaughlin and Gordon Davidson. And they live down in the San Francisco area, Marin County. And they went around the world for several years, talking to people, listening to people, connecting with people, and recognizing that there is a shift worldwide. We call it a paradigm shift. And that word paradigm is weird. Because in a way, it's sort of an oxymoron. But what we're really saying is the mental framework we bring to something. The mental framework we bring to something. So if we bring a mental framework to decision-making in groups that says, well, someone in charge will do it, we get stuck with what they decide. If we bring a mental framework that says everyone who is affected by this decision gets to have a voice in the decision-making process, that's a very different framework. What's been happening in the U.S. and in some other parts of the world is over time, and it started about the late 60s, we think, a process that was identified in the 70s as friendly fascism began to slowly but gently take over the country. And we now have an oligarchy ruling the country. And interestingly, as I was preparing for this, I took a break and caught up on the Facebook page, and there was a meme, and it said, the three houses of America, and one was Big Oil, Big Farm, and I've forgotten what the third one was, but it had already made its point. Right? We have a different kind of structure in place. It's a fascistic oligarchy. Ow. Ouch. Yeah, this is not what the U.S. is about. This is certainly not what we've been celebrating this week, and it's certainly not a government by the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? What happened? Gently, steadily, without ever really pushing anyone's buttons, people just quietly said, oh, I'll take care of that. We'll handle that for you. We'll do that. You don't have to be involved in that. We can do that. And they created a way of life that was so full that we just didn't have time to do it anyway, so we'll let them do it. In 1972, the average middle-class householder, adult, male or female, had 76 hours a week unscheduled time. 76 hours where nothing, waking hours. Okay, that was assuming you were sleeping 8 hours a night. 76 hours every week where you were not having to be at work, having to be shopping, having to be gardening, having to be whatever it was that was, church, whatever that was, the schedule of the week. Like I say, it was a slow, gentle, but steady process that ate up our time, ate up our energy, ate up our willingness to be involved in the decisions that affect us. In the book Spiritual Politics, one of the groups that they talk about is a group in New England. The Center for Living Democracy in Vermont. Some of you may recognize the founder, Francis Moore LaPay. Diet for a Small Planet. and her husband, Paul Martin Dubois, promotes a new concept called living democracy in contrast with formal democracy, or the moral community of protest, in order to overcome the myths that control our lives. The Institute empowers people to become effective citizens by, quote, learning the arts of democracy. And this is the list: active listening, dialogue, negotiating, reflection, creative controversy. Yeah. Active listening. Many of us in our jobs, whatever they were invited to take classes on active or reflective listening. And this is something that drove my children crazy. They would tell me something and I would say back to them, now if I've heard you correctly, you just told me. Well, yeah, that's what I just told you. Just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. However, when one is speaking with someone that one doesn't know speaks the same language, for example, they may have a jargon, or they may have grown up on the East Coast where they use one set of words instead of on the West Coast where we use another set of words. I had an interesting experience with Diane yesterday. She took her Davenport in to be reupholstered, and the clerk had no idea what she was talking about. So reflective listening can be very useful. And particularly when we're talking about things that affect all of us. Now, you've said so-and-so, but just to make sure I understand your use of the terms, and then you give them a slight variation on it. Right? Incredibly useful process, especially in a town meeting or a small group process where you're trying to make a decision. Now, did I hear you correctly? Is this what you said? Dialogue is one of my favorite things, and in fact, we're putting together a little website on mindful dialogue because of the Interdimensional Institute that I've been working with. And dialogue is a concept that's been forever, and I described it earlier when I was talking about what Indigenous people do. But David Bohm brought it forward into our awareness. And I love that at the same time one kind of thing is evolving, its counterpoint tends to evolve. So at the same time friendly fascism was beginning to be felt in our nation, David Bohm is saying, have you ever heard of dialogue? Let me tell you about dialogue. And he wrote a book on dialogue. And he gives people some very specific things, which I have shorthanded into listening from the heart and speaking from the heart. Listening from the heart and speaking from the heart. Because when we do that, something happens. What seems to emerge is that the left brain, that chatterbox, that one that has all the answers or insists that it ought to have all the answers, slowly but steadily gets crowded out. And what begins to emerge is the possibility of a new way of exploring and experiencing whatever it is we're talking about. And the positions tend to fall away. So in dialogue, what we do is we talk about what we're really caring about here. What is it that we're really longing for? What is it that we're really ready to experience next? And we listen. And maybe we do a little reflective listening. Now, as I was listening to you, I heard this, and I felt this, and this was what came up for me. And then the other person says, well, that was kind of it, but, or whatever. In dialogue, there is this sharing at such a remarkably deep level that literally we begin to create together. And what emerges is something that never existed before. And so I have this image that I use in my counseling space. That's the image that a Santa Fe artist did of two Native Americans, and they're facing each other, and there's this spiral, and it happens through the heart and through the ears, and then as it comes together, a butterfly comes out of it. Yes. So active listening and dialogue. And through the dialogue, what we find is we generally discover that we have very much the same issues, very much the same kind of concerns. But we've been taught or told that it has to come together in a specific way. It has to be like so, because that's what everybody says it has to be. And I'm going to get my issues addressed if it's like so. So we've been taught to take a position. If we can get to the underlying issues, then we can create a response that addresses the issues rather than reinforces the position. A friend of mine in the 80s, a colleague of mine in the systems science world, wrote a book called Peacemaking that was based on just that. When people come together and they lay out what it is they're concerned about, what it is they hope for, the list is very much the same almost always, rather than coming together saying, this is how we're going to fix it. So that's the next step in the process, discovering what the issues and the concerns are and beginning to explore new ways and new possibilities for accomplishing those. Now, in the process, sometimes there comes up things that we don't understand or we can't quite agree on, and this is where Frances and her husband suggest creative controversy might be appropriate. Okay? So if someone is saying, I need it to be blue, and the other one is saying, I need it to be pink, or something that is, you can't find that common ground in between. How about yellow? How about green? There might be, in the process of seeing that this seems to be unsolvable, offering a whole new creative idea that's out of the box, that is so different, that something new can emerge from this apparent controversy. Creatively, we introduce this possibility. And then invite people to be creative about how to make it work. So when someone in my family was going to have a baby and they didn't want to know ahead of time whether it was a boy or a girl, and they didn't want to inflict the boy and girl thing on them anyway, but some friends of theirs insisted on painting the nursery, they suggested that they do a garden theme with lots of green and yellow and a little bit of blue and pink. It worked. There are creative ways to address almost any conflict. But it takes coming from that heart space. And it takes realizing that the conflict is usually one of two things. It's either we're hearing each other differently, or we're coming from a place where we have to take a position rather than explore how to solve the issues. So, restoring the democratic process is restoring some of these activities and behaviors and ways of doing things. And I have to feel very good because in our audience, in our congregation, in our fellowship, Florence organizing has happened to do just that. Thank you very much. I got to hear about the lunch where the head of the Republican committee, the woman in charge there, and the head of the Democratic committee had lunch with me. How nice. Thank you, dear. So, one way that we can do what I suggest is to begin to create environments in which the differences are not as important as the similarities. Yes? And so people who would be on opposite sides of the fence get to experience, oh, well, on these matters, we're on the same side. And then that opens a space for something else. I've shared a story with a few of you. I went visiting Texas a few weeks ago and visiting the woman that I had spent my summers growing up with. I went on a farm every summer from ages 7 to 14. It was wonderful, learned a lot. She was a fabulous second mom for me, and she calls me one of her daughter nieces. And I hadn't seen her for years. In 2012, I was driving cross country, and I went to visit where she was living then. And she was telling me, it was November, it was just before Thanksgiving, she was telling me about how she had been, as a member, lifelong member of the Republican Women's Committee, invited to tabulate the votes, to monitor the tabulation of the votes. They had someone from each party watching them. So it's up in the clerk's office above the sheriff's office, and it's in an elevator. She's getting up there to go over there, and she gets into the elevator, and a lovely woman gets in after her. And they have a sweet chat as they're going up to the top of the building where the office is, where they're going to be monitoring this process. And oh my goodness, this very nice woman went around to the other side of the table. Could you believe she's a Democrat? This woman who had loved me and given me so much over the years. How could I not honor and respect where she comes from? And the naivete floored me. The idea that little bit of difference, one is voting for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is so different that you couldn't even be a nice person. Oh, wow. Yeah. I've been sitting with that ever since 2012. So I went to visit her a few weeks ago. I was there in June. And I was a little hesitant on the politics right now. And at one point I kind of said, well, how did you feel about the election? She says, well, we elected him. He's made some mistakes, but he'll learn. Okay. And then later, a day or so later, she says, we haven't really talked politics this trip. She said, what do you think? And then she mentioned the wrong agreement, but she was referring to the Paris Accord. And what do you think about, pulling out of the Paris Accord? And I thought, oh boy, here's a good one. And I said, well, I'm not sure the Paris Accord was all that good an agreement to begin with. I said, because it says we need to do this, 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 and this, and what we really need to be doing is this and this, and because of the interactions of this and this, and these other things that we need to be doing. And she looked at me and she said, wow, I had no idea there was that involved, that complicated. And then she laid off. There was no reason to go further into anything around politics, because clearly what I was doing was stepping outside of the politics world into what really needs to be done and what we can do about it. And I think something shifted there. I don't know that it'll affect her in what she does in the world, but it may. And it may affect how she interacts with the other people in her family who have similar thoughts. And as I drove around the part of Texas they are currently living in, I was intrigued. It's a 225-mile drive from Austin to this place, and I got exactly 7 minutes of NPR in that whole drive. Well, no wonder they think the way they think, really. Where are they going to get any other information if all they're getting is a very limited set of radio stations and TV stations? So, restoring the democratic process involves being open to not getting stuck in a position or a definition or a box or even a specific paradigm, but exploring what it is that we're really trying to accomplish here and becoming informed. What a strange notion, learning what it is that we're really talking about here. There was a wonderful survey, I think some of you may have heard about this, during the first time the Congress was going to get rid of what they call Obamacare, the Affordable Health Care Act. And someone did some polls, and what do you think of the affordable? If there were a health care program, what do you think of the name Affordable Health Care Act? It's fine. If there were a national health care program, what do you think about this measure and this measure and this measure? It was an exact description of what is now called Obamacare. 90% of Americans approved every element in that plan. But with the name Obamacare, it was not. It was like 20%. It was ridiculous. So, The Affordable Health Care Act is accepted and appreciated by Americans, but they don't want anything to do with something called Obamacare. Being informed, not being propagandized, is a huge thing. I register independent most of the time for that reason. All those reasons. I want to vote based on what I know and what I've studied and what I've understood. I became active in the League of Women Voters for that reason. It's pretty much gone now. It was a product of earlier generations, of women who weren't having to work full-time and manage a home at the same time. It was a product of an era when a household had 70+ hours of unscheduled time. So, restoring the process in this time and place requires all of those things, and fundamentally, it means we need to get out and be involved. I lived in Portland, Oregon for a while, and actually many decades, several decades, and became involved in the comprehensive planning process there. And the way that we did it in Portland fascinated me, because I've never seen it like this anywhere else. Portland has neighborhoods and neighborhood associations, and each one of them is a democratically elected leadership. And they are part of a district, and the district is a nonprofit organization where the neighborhood associations democratically elect and choose the board of that nonprofit organization. And then that nonprofit has a representative who is working with the city council in the neighborhood association's office of City Hall. So you can be 2 people away from City Hall in Portland by being active in the neighborhood associations. And what the city planners do at the comprehensive planning process is, it's a 10-year cycle in Oregon. We have this process where people get together and say, this is how we want our land to be used. It is not imposed on us people, well, unless you live in a county that does it behind closed doors, but that's another story. In Portland and Multnomah County, what the planners do is they let the neighborhood associations know this comprehensive planning process is coming up. We're going to have workshops. You choose the dates. We will come. We will present to you what is in place and what the options are that we are considering. And we invite you to tell us what you want your neighborhood to look like, feel like, act like in the next 10, 20, 50 years. And they do that. And everyone who attends those workshops gets to have a say in what their neighborhood is going to be like. And I lived in 2 or 3 different neighborhoods, and it was different in different neighborhoods, but basically what we wanted was pedestrian friendly. We wanted to be able to have additions to the house where people could rent a space if they needed it. We wanted to have gardens and lots of trees. We wanted to have an arterial on the edge of the neighborhoods. It was pretty consistent in the various neighborhoods I lived in. And what happened was then that information would go to the city planning office, and they would sit with it and see what was possible with the infrastructure that's in place and what changes could be made and what da-da-da-da-da. And they would come back and say, this is what we've come up with based on what we heard you say. And we would say, oh, no, you missed. You didn't get that one right. You got to change this. And oh, that one's got to change. And then, the neighborhoods would get 2 or 3 cycles through this. 30 to 50 to 150 people, depending on the neighborhood, participating in this workshop process. The old stickies on the sheets, the sticky notes up on the sheets. And then the city planners would take it to the council, the planning council, and say, this is what the neighborhoods have asked, this is what we've put together. And the planning council would then go through, the planning commission, the planning commission would go through and say, well, based on what we understand of our resources and so and so and so and so, we might have to modify it this way. Well, anyone can attend the planning commission. And so, the people in the neighborhoods who really cared would go to the planning commission, and if someone, did something or said something. Well, this was an interesting thing. Every now and then, there would be an individual who had attended no neighborhood workshops at all, show up at the planning commission and insist that his thing had to be a certain way. Wow. And sometimes, after the planning commission had approved it, and after everyone had gone through the next round, because this guy insisted, whatever, or this woman, it would go to the city council, and the planning commission would say, this is what we've come up with, and city council would, start listening to it. And sometimes someone would show up and say, wait a minute, I didn't ask for that, I insist that it be like this. And we go, you've had 7 months to speak your voice. Why are you participating at this point? And it was because they were staying out of the loop. They are out of the information process. They were too busy to listen during the development. And so those of us who have been working on it for 7 months are going, that person does not have the right to change what all of us have participated in, and yet sometimes they would. And so we would go back to the city council and we would say, wait a minute, this is what happened and this is why it happened and so on. In 1990, I coordinated a conference, an international conference. I attended a number of them. I was on the board of the International Society. And we held the conference at the Portland State University, which is right in the middle of downtown Portland. People have to come to the airport, which is on the outskirts, right, and wander through town and come into downtown. And about 15 people in this conference were from Eastern Europe, and in 1990 that was pretty amazing that they could get to Portland, Oregon from what was right on the edge of the Iron Wall and the Iron Curtain. And they came up to me and they said, who is the city designer? We need to meet him. And I said, that's all of us. There's 100 or so people in every neighborhood who participated in this. But I can have you meet the city planners because I already arranged for them to be at this conference. And they can tell you how our process works. The democratic process we have been taught is unwieldy and ineffective. It doesn't have to be. But it does take people really listening, people being informed, people willing to let go of their position and address the issues and the concerns. And often it requires small groups of people coming together in a circle and listening and speaking from the heart for as long as it takes.